You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium, available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean, and most other podcast platforms. Tonight's episode is about the Holmesburg Prison experiments. Holmesburg Prison, which was originally given the nickname of the Terrordome, was a prison operated by both the City of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Department of Prisons, or PDP for short, from the years of 1896 to 1995. It was the site of many controversial decades-long dermatological, pharmaceutical, and biochemical weapons research projects that involved the testing on inmates. All inmates who were tested on in the trials had consented to the experimentation. However, they mostly agreed due to incentives they would get, primarily monetary compensation, and in most cases these experiments were seen as an easy means to earn the money for their future freedom. The experiments and research that was conducted on the prisoners soon influenced ethical standards that are now still used today in modern research, with the creation of the Nuremberg Code, meaning the rule of informed consent, being drafted. A report on the prisons itself was released in 1968 after the result of the extensive 2-year investigation by both the offices of the Philadelphia Police Commissioner and the District Attorney of Philadelphia, who documented hundreds of cases of inmates being abused. As of today, the structure still stands, but it is now only occasionally used for prisoner overflow situations. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in once again and listening to this human guinea pig episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm a medium, an oracle card reader, a paranormal investigator, a ufologist, and a true crime buff. And to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every Monday night, though occasionally on a Tuesday, allowing for bank holidays and busy weekends, I do a podcast on the many wide and various subjects that fall under the unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters, and all different sorts of paranormal phenomena, including true crime, unsolved crime, and the many missing people cases that often go unnoticed. So if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the dark and disturbing stories surrounding the Holmesburg Prison experiments. This week's necessary disclaimer. As you have probably gathered, this story involves people having medical experimental procedures done to them, so may prove upsetting to some. Needless to say, you listen at your own discretion. Also, all opinions and comments are strictly my own, but the facts of the case remain. I also apologise if I pronounce anything incorrectly. My English, although it is my first and only language, my dictionary finds it a constant source of amusement. But anyway, let's get back to the story at hand. The village of Holmesburg itself began within the Lower Dublin Township in Pennsylvania, and although it is still in Pennsylvania, it is now a neighbourhood in the northeast section of Philadelphia in the United States. It was named in honour of cartographer, surveyor, and the General of Pennsylvania, a Mr. Thomas Holme. Also, according to Wikipedia, Holmesburg itself is bordered to the west by Browse Avenue to Ryan Avenue to Sandy Run or Pennypack Creek to Holme Avenue to Holmes Circle, Ashton Road to Willits Road, with the Delaware River to the east and Cotman Avenue to the south, and the border shared with Torresdale to the north being Welsh or Willits Academy Road, and then over to Linden Avenue. It sounds great, but I just hope I never get lost there. One of the most notable people who lived there was George Albert Castor, who lived from the 6th of June 1855 until the 19th of February 1906, who was a Republican member of the United States House of Representatives for Pennsylvania. George Castor was an unsuccessful candidate for the Republican nomination of Congressman at large in 1892, but was a member of the Republican City Committee for 15 years. He built an 18-bedroom mansion called Stonyhurst, overlooking the Pennypack Creek in Holmesburg, but as of 2018, the site was occupied by the Mother House of the Sisters of Missionary Servants of the Most Blessed Trinity, which is a Roman Catholic women's congregation that relocated there in 1931. Another notable person from Holmesburg was John Gibbon, who lived from the 20th of April 1827 to the 6th of February 1896, who was a career United States Army officer who fought in the American Civil War as well as the Indian Wars. He graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1847, was commissioned as a brevet second lieutenant in the 3rd U.S. Artillery, served in the Mexican-American War without seeing any combat, attempted to keep the peace between Seminoles and settlers in South Florida, and taught artillery tactics at West Point, where, in 1859, he wrote the Artillerist's Manual, which was a manual that was used by both sides in the Civil War. Quite impressive, I must say. Holmesburg Prison itself was first opened in 1896 as a response to the overcrowding in Philadelphia's Myomentzing Prison. A very quick, interesting spot here. Myomentzing Prison, which was designed by the American architect Thomas Ustick Walter, was a prison in the South Philadelphia neighborhood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Its cornerstone was laid on the 2nd of April 1832, and its doors opened on the 19th of October 1835, with it being in use for 140 years until 1963. Then, 5 years later, in 1968, it was eventually demolished. Holmesburg Prison's original philosophy centered around separate penal confinement, which mainly featured isolation tactics. However, the overpopulation quickly became a major problem at Holmesburg Prison, and consequently, as early as from 1928, riots occurred from prisoners due in part to the overcrowding in cells. Now, doesn't that remind you of the current situation with our prisons? On the 20th of August back in 1938, 23 prisoners decided that they would go on a hunger strike. And why was that, you ask? Well, it appears that the prisoners were not too happy about the quality of the prison food that they were getting at meal times. So, as a response to this hunger strike, the prison governor decided to deal with the inmates the only way he knew how. And what did he do? He placed them all into an isolation cell known as the Klondike. And because of the steam heat in this Klondike cell, where temperatures would reach up to nearly 200 degrees, 4 prisoners actually died, which resulted in the fact-finding of what would later be called the Bake Oven Death Investigations, with this investigation leading to the indictment of 10 prison officials, including the superintendent and the deputy warden. Now, I did have a good look as to why the Klondike room was given this particular name, and although I found various meanings for the word Klondike, for example, the cartoon character Klondike Pete, the Hotel and Casino Klondike, the Klondike board game, the Klondike TV series, the Klondike Gold Rush, and even a frozen treat made out of ice cream called the Klondike Bar. But as none of these examples seem likely to fit the reason for naming a solitary steam heat cell in a prison, I'll just have to leave it there. As far as I can tell, there has only been one escapee from Holmesburg Prison, and that was back in 1947 by the bank robber Willie Sutton, who, in the middle of serving a life sentence, escaped with the help of the other prisoners. And how did he do that? Simple. He climbed over the wall with a ladder, along with the help of other prisoners, of course, while they were all dressed in prison guard uniforms. Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia was the site of several scientific experiments on its inmates, which in turn raised the ethical and moral questions about the extent to which humans can be experimented on. And for the sake of a small monetary reward, many of Holmesburg's inmates chose to undergo several inhumane trials, with the prison itself eventually being viewed as a human laboratory with the inmate population as its subjects. Dr. Albert Kligman famously recounted when he first entered the Holmesburg prison that, and I quote, "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time," followed by, "It was an," and again I quote, "idle collection of humanity that seemed ideal for dermatological study." On a short but interesting side note here, Albert Montgomery Kligman, who lived from the 17th of March 1916 to the 9th of February 2010, a mere 94 years, was an American dermatologist who co-invented the acne medication known as Retina A with the American dermatologist and medical researcher Dr. James E. Fulton Jr. in 1969. Dr. Albert Kligman's experimentation on the prisoners was extensive, exposing inmates to, and I quote, herpes, staphylococcus, cosmetics, skin blistering compounds, radioactive isotopes, psychoactive drugs, and carcinogenic compounds such as dioxins. And, according to reports, he also received financial backing from, and again I quote, 33 different sponsors, including Johnson & Johnson, Dow Chemicals, and the U.S. Army. One Holmesburg prison inmate described some of the experiments that involved exposure to microwave radiation, along with the sulfuric and carbonic acid, which were solutions that corroded and reduced the forearm epidermis, which is the second and most superficial layer of skin, to a leather-like substance and blistered the skin around the testicular area. And in addition to exposure to harmful chemical agents, inmates, or patients, depending on your point of view of course, were also asked to physically exert themselves so that they could immediately be put under the knife in order to have their sweat glands removed for examination. In some more rather gruesome accounts of experimentation on the inmates, it was reported that fragments of dead bodies, or corpses, were stitched onto the backs of some of the prison volunteers to determine if these fragments could ever grow back into functional organs, with one former prisoner or prison volunteer or patient recounting how, and I quote, "They used my body. They did things to me that were inhuman. I feel less than a woman because of the things they did to me. This brought me pain, a lot of pain." Some of these experiments did not simply affect the well-being of the individual inmates. In some cases, they would also affect the health of the entire cell block. This was mainly due to the doctors experimenting with biological agents, which included strains like Hong Kong flu, poison ivy and or poison oak, with the experimentation being so common that in the 1,200 person prison facility, eventually around 80 to 90% of the prison inmates were experimented on at any one time. There was a wide range of experiments that were conducted on the inmates at Holmesburg Prison. And while these experiments started off with a focus on dermatological research, eventually they were also conducted to evaluate both commercial pharmaceutical products and biochemical substances. The dermatological experiments included 1. A study examining the ways a person's foot could be infected with ringworm, with enormous quantities of fungi being administered to prison inmates, after which they had to wear their boots for a week. 2. A study where the prisoners were infected with various skin viruses such as herpes simplex and wart bacteria. And 3. Studies exposing the prisoners to long ultraviolet rays, along with different versions of yeast products such as Candida albicans, which is an opportunistic pathogenic wee yeast, I'll get that right in a minute, that is a common member of the human gut flora that can survive outside the human body. The biochemical experiments included a study of testing dioxins, which was the poisonous substance in Agent Orange. On another interesting side note, Agent Orange is a chemical weed killer and defoliant and one of the tactical use rainbow herbicides. It was used during the Vietnam War from 1961 to 1971 by the US military as part of its herbicidal warfare program called Operation Ranch Hand. In addition to its damaging environmental effects, traces of dioxin found in the mixture have caused major health problems and deformities for many individuals over the years who were exposed to it, including their children. I have done a podcast episode on Agent Orange, so if you want to hear more details of how it affected Vietnam, both in terms of the environment and its population, it is available on Spreaker or Google Podcast, episode number 41. The dosages of the aforementioned dioxin, which the prison inmates were exposed to, were 468 times greater than those detailed in the company's protocol. And one of Dr. Albert Kligman's motivations for these human experiments, as well as job satisfaction, of course, is that the Dow Chemical Company had asked for these tests to be done, along with giving him a compensation payment of $10,000. All the Holmesburg prison inmates who were tested on during these trials had consented to all the experimentation. However, they mostly agreed to these tests due to the incentives like monetary compensation rewards, which in the prison usually paid between $30 to $50, but could sometimes go as high as $800, making the prison experiments pay much higher compared to other prison jobs. And as Philadelphia's prisons at the time allowed inmates to end their sentence if they could pay for 10% of the set bail amount, this option was, of course, to prisoners anyway, a no-brainer. It was even reported that some inmates, during what was known as the perfume experiments, were literally renting their bodies out for cash. In a later interview with Dr. Albert Kligman, he recounted that he was amazed by the prison's potential for research and that the controlled conditions of the prison did appeal to him, in that having the inmates' diet and lifestyle standardized would minimize any disruptions to his medical research. After Dr. Albert Kligman's first visit to the penitentiary, he decided he would begin conducting his experiments at Holmesburg. He said, and I quote, "I began to go to the prison regularly, although I had no authorization. It was years before the authorities knew that I was conducting various studies on prisoner volunteers. Things were just much simpler then. Informed consent was unheard of. No one asked me what I was doing. It was a wonderful time." Albert Kligman then obtained permission to conduct the aforementioned dermatological experiments on the inmates from the superintendent of Holmesburg Prison, who agreed with the doctor that the experiments could benefit both the medical realm and the prison itself. But it is worth pointing out here that although everything was hunky-dory between the good doctor and the superintendent, there were no formal contracts between the prison or city and the University of Pennsylvania, as it was perceived by both parties that the inmates belonged to the state. It reinforced the belief that practicing medical experiments on people who had potentially committed crimes was, in their minds, impartial. Many advocates of the prison trials, such as the prison administrator and Mr. Solomon McBride, remain convinced that there was nothing wrong with the experimentation at Holmesburg Prison, with Solomon McBride arguing that the experiments were nothing more than strapping patches of cloth with lotion or cosmetics onto the backs of patients. But not only that, he also argued that this was a means for prisoners to earn an easy income. And furthermore, it was also believed that by doing these experiments, the Holmesburg Prison was contributing to society. For example, in the development of the aforementioned Retin A as an acne medication. Although there were proponents of the medical experiments system at Holmesburg Prison, the testing on inmates was eventually halted by public and legal pressure. To defend experimentation practices, Holmesburg Prison began to insist upon the use of formal contracts in order to absolve the prison of any responsibility. However, many claim that these contracts were in fact void due to the lack of informed consent. News stories regarding these medical experiments on inmates would reflect Holmesburg Prison in a negative light. In 1973, a congressional hearing on human experimentation was organized. The hearing was supposed to discuss the Tuskegee syphilis study and to clarify the ethical and legal implications of human experimental research. However, what it mainly seemed to achieve was a negative public opinion regarding using humans as guinea pigs when it came to medical study. On an interesting side note, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male was a study conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the United States Public Health Service, or PHS for short, and the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, on a group of nearly 400 African American men with syphilis. The purpose of this study was to observe the effects of the disease when untreated, though by the end of the research, medical advancements meant that it was in fact entirely treatable. However, the men who had syphilis were not informed of the nature of the experiment, and because of this purposeful misinformation, more than 100 of them died. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the United States to victims of the research, calling it shameful and racist. I will be doing an episode of Mark's Unexplained World on the Tuskegee study later in 2025. With the negative light by the general public now being shone on the Holmesburg Prison and the use of prisoners for medical experiments, the climate called for a conscious public to rally against the use of vulnerable populations, such as prisoners, as guinea pigs. with companies and organisations who associated themselves with medical human testing facing severe backlash. Amidst the numerous Senate hearings, public relation nightmares, and opponents to penal experimentation, the county prison boards in Pennsylvania very soon realized that human experimentation was no longer acceptable to the American public, and so as a result, human testing on prisoners was phased out in the United States. The Holmesburg Prison experiments conducted by Dr. Albert Kligman led to many questions about the ethics behind him using prison inmates for his medical research. And since the inmates weren't being made aware of exactly what substances were being tested on them at the time, there were many issues around this informed consent. And as the public became more aware of the testing that had occurred within the Holmesburg prison walls, some of the ex-prisoners started realizing that they had a right to sue those in charge of the experiments. So in the 1980s, a few of the Holmesburg's former prisoners who had participated in the dioxin experiments decided to file lawsuits against Dow Chemical. Other groups and companies such as Johnson & Johnson, Dr. Albert Kligman's company, and the University of Pennsylvania in the year 2000 faced a class action lawsuit that was filed by 298 of Holmesburg's ex-prisoners, with this lawsuit itself requesting, amongst other things, free medical care and financial compensation for those former prisoners and test subjects. However, just 2 years later, in 2002, the federal court eventually ruled that the statute of limitations had passed, and so dismissed the former prisoner's case. The Holmesburg prison inmates were not alone when it came to being used as human guinea pigs for medical research, as it eventually transpired through questioning that Dr. Albert Kligman and his company had been running these kinds of experiments on prison inmates in various other locations throughout the second half of the 20th century, with these experiments being limited to just prisoners by the United States Department of Health, Education and Welfare in 1976. Ironically, the United States had been strong enforcers of the Nuremberg Code, and yet had not followed the convention's rules until the 1990s, even though the Nuremberg Code states, and I quote, "The person involved should have the legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision." As you have probably gathered by now, the Nuremberg Code is a set of ethical research principles for human experimentation created by the court in the US versus Brandt case, which was one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials that were held after the Second World War. During the 1960s, back at Holmesburg, prisoner and guard tensions were mounting, with violence between inmates and abuse by the guards. By 1968, 85% of the prisoners at Holmesburg were black, as also were the lower-ranking guards, while the supervisors at Holmesburg were white. So, on the 4th of July 1970, violence broke out that injured over 100 people. My apologies. Frank Rizzo, who was the current Philadelphia Police Commissioner and future Mayor of Philadelphia, blamed the violence on politicized African Americans who attacked white inmates and guards. However, this theory was challenged by reform organisations and groups that blamed the violence to overcrowding with the lack of meaningful activities for prisoners and the abuse by the guards. Holmesburg Prison eventually closed in 1995. But up until 2017, it was often used for tactical training exercises and the location for many scenes in various films, including a 2014 episode of a paranormal reality show called Ghost Stalkers. Today, as of the time of writing this show, Holmesburg no longer allows any visitors. This includes citizens, film crews, photographers, or historians to have any access to the building or its grounds, as it is still occasionally used for prisoner overflow. Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. Our next episode, show number 130, we're going to be looking at the death of Dominique Doone. Dominique Ellen Doone was an American actor who got her big break from starring as Dana Freeling in the horror film Poltergeist in 1982. On the 30th of October 1982, she was strangled by her ex-boyfriend John Thomas Sweeney during an argument on the driveway of her West Hollywood home. She fell into a coma and died 5 days later. In a court case that gained significant media coverage, John Sweeney was convicted of voluntary manslaughter in Dominique's death and served just 3.5 years in prison. This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, and proofread and edited by Linda Hughes. Pronunciations of all the names, that was me. The actors in this episode were just me, Mark Hughes. Unfortunately, I've got a few techie issues this week, so you just had to listen to me droning on for the last half an hour. But Linda will be back next week, and Denise as well. With special thanks, of course, to Neil Packer and the staff at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley, and of course a big thank you to everyone for listening. We never run out of ideas here at the office for Mark's Unexplained World podcast. But if you know of any other intriguing stories under the Unexplained banner, including ufology, hauntings, disasters, and any other sort of paranormal phenomena, as well as true crime, unsolved crime, and missing people, just drop me a direct message and I'll see what I can do. And I will also include the name of the person who suggested the idea in the end credits of the podcast, if you are happy to do that, of course. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any other podcast platform, again, give us a like and a follow. A thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember, guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. This show and all its contents are covered by the basic copyright of Mark the Medium.